This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. This morning I have with me John Rubino, well-known author and publisher of the website dollarcollapse.com. Good morning, John. Welcome back.
Morning, Gord. Nice to be back.
John, what we're going to do here this morning is I wanted to talk about what the rich are doing with their money, because you recently put out just a great article, and it looked like it was part one of a series. But before we do, I want to talk about what's going on in the global around the world right now in the various economies, because we're a lot of breaking news even as we're going here live here this morning. And I've got up a chart of list of some of the countries, and I wonder if we just kick it off with your views on this.
Well, the global economy is slowing down dramatically, Gord. Japan, the third largest economy in the world, just dropped back into recession, despite a really aggressive debt monetization / QE program of the last year or two. And Europe is flatlining. Italy's back in recession. France is pretty close to it, and they just announced that they're going to miss their deficit targets yet again, which means, in theory, they have to adopt even more aggressive austerity. And China's bad loans are soaring because they basically borrowed $15 trillion starting in 2008 and were largely the engine that pulled the global economy out of that crisis. Now they got all this bad debt that they have to deal with from all these unwise loans that they made during that time. And so they're in the early stages of the bursting of a credit bubble. And the U.S., meanwhile, is the only quote-unquote success story in the world right now, and it's not growing dramatically. We're crawling along right now. This definitely isn't an acceptable growth level, and the idea that we can even keep this up with the rest of the world dropping into recession is probably a little over-optimistic. So basically, the whole world is slowing down now at a time when it was hoped that it would be accelerating into a time of organic, sustainable growth and low deficits and all the rest that we define as a healthy economy. Well, that's not happening.
I think, John, too, I totally agree. I think what's happened is just the recent PPI numbers, the global industrial numbers by country. I think it really shook people and the central bankers, because it was much worse on such a global scale. They knew it was slowing, but I think it was the rate. And I think it's clearly prompted the ECB Draghi to do some thinking here, especially with inflation just falling like a stone right across the EU, and China specifically with their lending and deposit rates, because they said they're trying to react very, very quickly. Then we saw 2 weeks ago Japan. Yeah.
Well, China is using a lot less natural resources now because it's building fewer buildings, roads, and whole cities than it did during the credit bubble. And wages aren't growing anywhere. So you put those two things together and you get deflation, and that's what the world is looking at right now. And that terrifies central bankers because in an over-indebted system, deflation is death, because it makes your debts harder to manage at the same time that you're still accumulating more debts, and that eventually leads the system to implode. You get a 1930s style debt-driven depression, capital D depression, if this is allowed to continue. And they know that. So around the world, we're seeing signs that new stages of quantitative easing are beginning. Europe, as you said, Draghi just came out, and instead of his old quotes, which didn't really lead to any kind of quantitative easing, now he's saying we will do whatever we must in order to increase inflation as quickly as possible. And that means pretty aggressive debt monetization going forward. Japan is ramping up their QE program. China just cut interest rates. And so you're seeing fairly aggressive moves around the world to try to stave off incipient deflation. around the world. And, the last batch of stuff like this didn't work. QE basically failed for these guys. And so now they have no choice but to up the ante and increase the amount of currency that they're creating and shoving out into the banking system. And, it's hard to believe that this works if the last batch didn't work, but that's all they have left. So that's what we're going to see around the world in 2015.
So the drug isn't working, patient's not reviving, so give them more drug.
Give them more drugs. That's right.
No matter even if we're in a coma right now with the debt, but clearly they see no other solution. But John, deflation is actually good for the average person. Deflation is terrible for those that are for the lenders. But if you're a borrower, it's a pretty good deal. And if you've got debt out there and your costs are going down as an individual, but it's killing the pensioners, it's killing the savers.
Well, a healthy economy, for the 200 years of the classical gold standard, when money got slightly more valuable year after year, that there was deflation around the world regularly year after year, and that's a sign of a healthy economy. As you get more productive, stuff should get a little bit cheaper.
Precisely.
But in the age of fiat currency and rising debt, deflation is really dangerous because we owe too much money. So we're a world of borrowers right now, and deflation is bad for borrowers because it means you have to pay back your debts in ever more valuable currency, which makes it harder and harder year after year. And so eventually it becomes impossible. You default, and then the guys you lent money to default, and then the system just collapses under the weight of all the debt that it's taken on. And so that's the specter that's haunting the world's central banks right now. And it's a near-term problem. I mean, this could happen in the next couple of years if we allowed current trends to continue. If Europe drops back into recession, in which the euro gets a little more valuable every year, Japan also drops back into recession or stays in recession, and the yen gets more valuable, these economies will be in a hole that they can never get out of. They'll just be sucked into the vortex of all of this debt. And these are major economies. If they go down, the rest of the world gets pulled down with them. And so the world's central bankers, because of their past mistakes, are now in this box where they have no choice but to aggressively devalue their currencies. They got to make their money worth less so that their borrowers can pay back their debts. And the only way you do that, or actually it's not the only way you do it, but the only way they understand to do it is to just create huge amounts of new currency and shovel it out into the banking system and hope that pushes down the value of their currency. And so far it hasn't worked, so we'll see if the next batch does.
So, John, the question is, what are the rich doing right now to take advantage of this, or what are they worrying about? Because I know you've been doing some work on this one.
Yeah, this is one of the really interesting parts of the story, because you would think in a world where deflation is gaining steam, that the price of high-priced assets, things that have already gone way up, would be crashing. But the opposite is the case, because basically the way the system works, the way the monetary system works, is the central banks create new currency. They give it to the big banks, who then give it to their preferred customers. So basically, you get the rich getting richer in this kind of an environment. And today's rich people have more money than they know what to do with. They've got huge amounts of cash, and they've got financial assets like stocks and bonds that are way up and that they don't really trust going forward. So what they're doing is cashing out a lot of their appreciated financial assets and converting that capital to real assets. So we're seeing,
John, what do you mean by real assets?
Fine art, London and Manhattan penthouses, things like that. For instance, Christie's, the big auction house, just had a contemporary art sale that raised in one evening $852 million. And that's a new record that exceeded their expectations. And when the last Andy Warhol sold, the report is that the audience was so stunned by the prices being paid for these things that they didn't even applaud. Normally, after a big sale, you get the audience applauding there. And these guys just sat there. They were stunned by the amount of money that's being thrown at fine art right now. And the reason for that is that there's nowhere else to go for guys with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of cash in a world where cash is aggressively being inflated away by the world's central banks. So you've got rich folks who either are financially sophisticated or are employing people who are financially sophisticated to advise them, actively converting their financial assets into real stuff. A stat just came out this morning that in the U.S., $1 million plus houses, the sales of them just jumped by 16%. So while the rest of the U.S. real estate market is growing very slowly, and in a lot of places not growing at all, the high end of the market is booming. And again, that's a sign that the 1% has more cash than it knows what to do with. And that means that they're losing faith in the world's fiat currencies. You know, if they thought the dollar and the yen and the euro were rock solid, they would be fairly comfortable just letting that money sit there. But they don't expect the world's major currencies to hold their value going forward. So they're actively converting those currencies into stuff that the governments of the world can't create in unlimited quantities. You know, they can't make any more Andy Warhols or Van Goghs. They can't really make any more London penthouses. You know, there's a limited supply of these things. And so you have a better chance of preserving your capital if you put your money into things like that. And so that's what we're seeing at the top end of the market. So now the question becomes, does everybody else figure out the same thing that the world's rich people know and start acting accordingly? And then what happens?
So what they're doing is they're practicing the Austrian school of the indirect exchange. Get out of paper and get into something that is tangible, real, and is in some relative short supply, where there's some limit. There's no limit to how much the government can print in paper, but there's a limit to the amount of Andy Warhol paintings. So any kind of limitation is where their money is moving. And all the examples you're giving, whether art, property, collectibles, gold and silver, antique cars, diamonds, etc., those are all examples of something that's limited.
Yeah, things that are rare and real, that don't require somebody else to keep a promise. You know, with a stock or a bond or a piece of currency, somebody else has to act in a certain way for you to get your money back out. You know, the bank has to be able to give you back your savings account, or the government has to prudently and honestly manage the currency that you're holding, or else it'll lose value. You know, somebody else has to keep a promise. So financial assets have counterparty risk. Real assets do not. A London penthouse is a London penthouse, no matter what the government happens to be doing at a given moment. Or gold coins for 3,000 or 4,000 years now have held their value, while governments and fiat currencies have risen and fallen. And through it all, a gold coin will buy basically the same amount of life's necessities as it did back during the time of the Roman Empire. You know, an ounce of gold bought you a nice toga back in the days of Julius Caesar. Today it'll buy a reasonably nice men's suit, you know, and so things like that are where financially sophisticated people go when financial assets are being mismanaged and are becoming excessively risky. And so we're seeing the future in the activities of the 1% right now.
I think you're exactly right. We're seeing the future, John, because in my mind, what they're doing is they're really reassessing what wealth is, the true definition of wealth, because it's no longer can be financial paper or financial assets where there's not a store because it can be printed, whether it's a fiat, and fundamentally it started with the advent of fiat currencies, but it's accelerating here. And wealth is to me is what others want, what people want at any given time. And so you have, right now we have inflation where we have inflation of what we need versus what we want, and we pay cash versus what we for financing, whereas we have deflation is what we want versus what we need, and we finance it versus paying cash. And that's the example of it getting out of money, that not being a true store, and it's accelerating at a phenomenal rate. And you know, the tougher the economy gets, John, the more the basics become wealthier. They have a higher purchasing power, if you would. If things are really bad, wealth can be a meal. But things are really, really good. The most abstract piece of art can be worth a fortune. But as economies slow, you see that. And that little example I just said, where economies have heavy debt, we're seeing deflation. where we're seeing that they're emerging or growing, they've got inflation at an elevated rate. Now, there's a reason with money being transferred, but the wealthy have figured this out. Unfortunately, the non-wealthy are paying the price right now.
Yes. Yeah, what we're seeing right now is deflation in the lives of average people. Wages are in real terms going down. The average family in the U.S. makes less in real terms now than it did 2 decades ago. And meanwhile, the average person in the 1% is vastly richer than they were even a few years ago. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because that's exactly how the monetary system is set up. The big banks, in a fiat currency system, financial companies get more and more powerful because they're the ones who get the new money that the central banks are creating. And so they eventually come to run the global financial system, which is where we are now. So Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, these guys get to create wealth doing all kinds of semi-unethical and sometimes blatantly illegal things with impunity. They get away with it. And they then take some of that money that they're making, funnel it into the political system, and buy enough votes to be immune from any kind of regulation or prosecution. And that's where we are now. And it's only going to accelerate. The world's central banks are now embarking on another stage of quantitative easing that's going to be bigger than the last one, which means more and more money is going to flow into the big banks now, which will then flow to the accounts of the favored customers of these big banks. So we're beginning another stage of this. And so we could see a global real asset melt up at some point, where already, the charts look parabolic, where you see fine art just going through the roof, and farmland and high-end real estate. So what happens next if we give these guys another $5 trillion to play with? And they're already, they already own all the financial assets they want, and they really don't want to raise more cash because they've raised a lot of cash already. There was an article out just lately about how billionaires around the world are raising cash very aggressively, and they've got record amounts of just cash sitting there. So they don't want any more of that. So what are they going to do? Probably keep buying the stuff that they've been buying, because if a Van Gogh is worth $100 million right now, why can't it be worth $200 million at the next auction? And it's all make-believe anyhow, based on not the value of the Van Gogh, but the value of the fiat currency that you're converting into a Van Gogh. And if the fiat currency becomes dramatically less valuable, then why not pay higher and higher prices for these assets? So that's the thing we could be looking at here. And since we're already looking at it, I don't think it'll be that dramatically different from today. But the question is, does it spread? Does the idea spread to the middle class? Do we start en masse converting our financial assets, to the extent that we have any, into real assets? And then do we get the Austrian economics crack-up boom, where nobody wants to hold fiat currencies anymore? We're dumping them to buy real stuff at any price, and that which manifests as hyperinflation, but not because the supply of the currency suddenly spikes, but because our faith in the currency suddenly cratered. And I think that's what we're heading for if we allow this process to continue. And it definitely looks like we're allowing it to continue, because, as you said, if the first shot didn't work, then all we have left is a bigger shot. We can only give the addict more heroin because all we have left is heroin. And so the next few years are going to be, from an economic theory standpoint, about the most fascinating few years that have ever been, but they're not going to be fun for a lot of people. Living through interesting times is fun in theory, but terrible in practice, and that, I'm afraid, is going to be the case for a lot of people around the world.
John, one last question before we go. What does the average person who doesn't have a lot of assets, unless they're in maybe a limited amount in some kind of retirement plan, what do they do today, knowing this?
That's a tough one, because most retirement plans only give you the option of cash, stocks, bonds, things like that. And so the average person doesn't have the same options that the guy who's buying an Andy Warhol has. But you can buy silver coins, which historically have done great in situations like this. Gold coins, more expensive, but same thing. If there's a chance to buy a little bit of farmland.
But they're going down, aren't they? Or they have been going down for quite a period of time.
You know, precious metals are one of the really interesting parts of this story because, normally, historically, they've been right there with farmland and high-end real estate and fine art because it's one of the things that rich people tend to buy when they're nervous about fiat currencies. You know, you convert your paper that's being destroyed by the government into the kind of money that humans have used for 3,000 or 4,000 years and that has held its value during all that time, and you ride out the storm. But right now, gold and silver are down hard. You know, they've had a dramatic bear market over the last 3 years at a time when you wouldn't expect something like that because the world's central banks are actively trying to make their paper currencies less valuable. You know, and there are a lot of people who think there's active manipulation going on here, and I don't have any inside information about that, but it makes intuitive sense. If all the other markets of the world are manipulated, which they are now, you know, you've got central banks buying equities and governments actively playing around in the bond market, why wouldn't gold and silver, which are competing forms of money, also be manipulated by the world's governments? So that explains a lot of the weird trading behavior where somebody will come in at lunchtime on the Japanese market when all the traders are gone and dump $1 billion worth of gold futures contracts and just smash the price down. Now, if you were trying to get a good price for your futures contracts, that's not the time or the place or the method to do so. And yet it's happening out there. So the implication is that there's an attempt at manipulating precious metals lower. But that is beginning to backfire because you're seeing the Asians basically buy all the gold that's available right now. You know, India and China and Russia between them are snarfing up more gold than is being produced by the world's gold mines for the second straight year. And so where does that gold come from, you know, to make up the difference? It must be coming from Western central banks. And there are a lot of stats that indicate that that's the case, that we're shipping huge amounts of gold to China and India and Russia right now. And so how long can that go on? Eventually, we run out of gold. And they're not running out of dollars because they're still running trade surpluses. They still have more dollars coming in than they know what to do with. So they're acting like the 1%, but with regard to gold and silver, more than fine art. And although, you know, Chinese are just one of the driving forces behind at least the purchase of high-end real estate. There's a lot of money coming out of China and going into San Francisco and Vancouver and London and New York. So at the same time they're buying up a lot of precious metals, they're also driving these other trends of the super rich. But when does it end? That's the question, you know, and silver is the same way. Silver coin demand in the last few months has just absolutely gone through the roof. The U.S. Mint had to stop selling silver eagles because they ran out of them. And they just started again, but it's on allocation where they only have a limited amount, so they're giving a little bit to this dealer, a little bit to that dealer, but not nearly as much as the dealers want.
Yet silver hasn't gone up dramatically.
No, silver's way down. Silver is way down. So at the same time the price is tanking, demand is soaring. That doesn't normally happen in markets. You know, usually demand drives price one way or the other. If demand is going up, you see prices rise to accommodate.
In a fair and free market.
In a fair and free market.
And when that doesn't happen, it begs the question. But that's for another day, I guess, John. But so you're saying, I'm talking about the average person out there. It says, well, gold and silver, yes, but there could be a little bit of pain here for a while, and who knows fully how that's manipulation. But what other options may they have before we close?
One more thing about precious metals. You know, when I'm saying they're grossly undervalued and this is going to blow up at some point and they'll soar, that doesn't mean immediately convert all your free cash into precious metals. What that means is start nibbling. You know, buy a little bit each month because you know it's cheap. You don't know when it's going to go up, but you have a reasonable expectation that that's what's going to happen. So nibble. And don't completely commit to a market like this that could theoretically be smashed back down even further. You know, if silver's gone from $50 to $15 an ounce, there's no reason why it can't go to $5 because it shouldn't have gone to $15 in the first place. So take your time, do dollar cost averaging, and eventually you'll have gotten a good average price for what you buy. Other stuff you can do is pay off debt because this can't end well. And when it ends badly, it's going to mean weird things happening in the jobs market, in the housing market. Stuff is going to get crazy for a while, and your life is going to get less and less certain, including your job, including your savings. So, and there are going to be bank bail-ins in which banks get into trouble and the government just loots bank accounts in order to prop up these banks that are failing. And so even your bank account isn't safe anymore. So the logical thing to do in circumstances like that is to pay off as much debt as possible. If you've got a mortgage, work it down. If you've got credit cards, by all means, pay them off and then cut them up and throw them in the trash. Same thing with the car loan. You shouldn't be borrowing money to buy a car in this kind of an environment. You should be hunkering down, living small, and preparing to protect yourself from a period of turmoil in which things you used to count on maybe aren't that reliable anymore.
John, in talking about loans, the last crisis was about the subprime collapse in specific mortgages, and we've always been concerned about subprime. But I was reading this morning about the auto sales going through the roof, and it's because of the growth and now something they call deep subprime. Yeah. So it's not subprime; it's deep subprime, yep, and the defaults are 71% growth month over month as something's hitting. So this is not everything. Just seems to come around, or goes around, or comes around rather.
Well, I do a series on dollarclaps.com called "What Blows Up First."
Yes.
That looks at these sectors and tries to make some kind of a prediction about what the thing that's right on the edge of blowing up might be. And auto loans, like you said, that's one of them for sure. Because last year it was student loans. Now we're ramping up auto loans and digging into even lower than subprime in order to lend money to people. And the other big thing is shale oil junk bonds. That's been the biggest boom in the U.S. has been new ways of getting oil out of the ground. And huge amounts of money have been borrowed in order to ramp up drilling in places like the Bakken Field in the mountain states in the U.S. And a lot of that money has been borrowed in the junk bond markets. And now that oil prices have dropped from $100 plus per barrel to $80 or so, a lot of that junk debt is no longer covering. And so we could see the first crack in this credit bubble happen in shale oil junk bonds. So that's something to keep an eye on.
John, when you print this amount of money for this length of time, we get unintended consequences and moral hazard, which leads to mispricing of risk, the lack of price discovery, and therefore the examples we're seeing are to be expected. But what happens is printing more money just makes that problem worse, and eventually something cracks. It always does, when we don't know. And then there's a rush for the doors because liquidity disappears in a heartbeat and credit. And I was talking to Tim Price in London, and I said to Tim, I says, Tim, it reminds me of being in a theater and somebody yells fire, and we all head for the door. And he says, no, Gord, that's not what's going to happen. It's going to be different this time. And I says, how's that? He says, because they've barricaded the doors. So this time what's going to happen, the only way you're going to get out is you've got to exchange your seat for somebody who's not in the theater. And I thought, and who's going to do that? And he says, that's exactly the problem.
That is but that's really what we're talking about, Gordon.
Exactly.
Leave the theater now. Get up halfway through the movie and get out. Don't stay in the theater.
That's what Tim's suggestion was.
Yeah,
he says, don't wait. It's time. You might want to consider exiting.
Absolutely.
John, we got to run. Great conversation. So many things to talk about. Looking forward to having you back next month. Can you tell our listeners where they can learn more about your writings and the things you're working on?
Sure. I run dollarclaps.com, which is a site that covers a lot of this stuff, and just published a book with Gold Money's James Turk called The Money Bubble that also covers a lot of this stuff and makes a lot of specific predictions about what you can do to protect yourself.
Always a great conversation. Looking forward to next month.
Thanks, Gord.
Talk to you then. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.